Hey babe, it looks like we're going to need that flamethrower again. Unfortunately, saltwater aquariums are an ecosystem and there are a lot of things that we can end up with in our tanks that we just don't want. In this video, we're going to cover 10 of the most common pests that could f up your saltwater tank. How's it going, everybody? I'm Logan from Reef Rookies and I teach people how to do saltwater aquarium stuff. I've been keeping aquariums for over 30 years. So if you feel like this is the kind of information that you need, be sure to like and subscribe to the video, and let's get started. The first one we're going to talk about is aiptasia. Now, these can get into your tank by the way of a coral frag or a piece of live rock or a piece of rubble or even some sand that you get from somebody else when you're setting up your aquarium, or even after you've set it up and you add that new piece to your tank, you can end up with these guys. Now, they do grow pretty fast and they do sting other corals and sometimes fish, so they pose a at least significant threat to what you have going on in your aquarium. There's a couple of different ways that you can get rid of them, and busting them up and brushing them off the rocks is definitely not one. That's a great way to spread them and make the problem worse. Now, you could take the live rock or the piece of coral or whatever out of the tank and use some sort of a sharp instrument to dig underneath the foot of this, because it is an anemone, pop it off and throw it away. Another way that you can take care of these guys is by injecting them with something with a syringe that is not sustainable for their life to keep going. Lemon juice is an option. Citric acid is another one. Distilled white vinegar is the one that I use most often. And there are even consumerism products out there on the market like aiptasia with mixed results on how well or not they work. Another thing you can do is mix up some caulk paste and then apply that directly all over the top of the anemone, and that chemical just burns the anemone and it dies off, and then it's gone out of your tank. There are some animals that you can get to take care of these guys for you, and some work better than others. Peppermint shrimp, but only 2 of the 6 species available actually eat aiptasia, and they only eat them when they're relatively small. They won't mess with the really big ones. Copperband butterfly fish sometimes eat aiptasia, and sometimes they don't. So I wouldn't recommend that you get this fish just for that purpose. If you want one and you have room in your tank and they do eat aiptasia for you, then that's great. But I wouldn't go out and buy one just to solve this problem. And aiptasia eating filefish is a much better option, more suited for that. And really the only thing that is going to 100% every time eat every aiptasia in your tank are Bergia nudibranch. Now, if you get these guys, you have to make sure that you don't have fish in the tank that are going to eat the nudibranch. That's very important because they are pretty expensive at about $25 a pop for a little 1/4-inch big nudibranch. But these guys are obligate aiptasia eaters. It is their only food source. So if you can take that rock that has that aiptasia on it out and put it in a quarantine system, put 4 to 6 Bergia in there with it, they will eat every cell of the aiptasia off of that rock, and then you can pick the little Bergia guys off, leave them in the quarantine, put the rock back in the main display, and then you can move those Bergia on to somebody else who needs them or what have you. Next up on the list is a majano anemone, and it's taken care of very similarly to aiptasia, but they're a little smaller. They look a little bit like a little small green bubble-tipped anemone, but they still do sting and they can populate your aquarium quite fast, over competing the corals and stinging them, making them close up and things like that. So it's just not something that we want. Similarly to aiptasia, you can take the rock out and dig underneath them to pop them off. You can inject them with those things I mentioned before, or use the kalkwasser paste kind of situation on these guys as well. Or there is something on the market called a majano wand. And it's basically an electronic device, and you can put it down in the tank right on top of that thing, turn it on, and it puts an electrical current through that anemone, which prevents it from being able to sustain life. And they do work, but some people have said that after they used it, they saw an explosion in population of these majano anemones, which makes sense to me because you're killing the animal, it breaks apart, but the cells are still there, and some of those may still be viable. And it only takes 1 or 2 cells to latch on somewhere and create a whole new animal. People have also said that butterfly fish will eat these as well, but it's the same situation as with the aiptasia. Don't get the butterfly fish just to try to take care of this problem, because it's very hit or miss of whether or not they're going to have a taste for these guys or if they even find it in your aquarium if you have a big tank like I do. Next up on the list is our first toxic pest that you might find in your aquarium, and that is a planaria flatworm. They look like this, and these little guys, if you see one, you probably already have a couple of hundred in your tank. And they come in just like those other things did, either on some rock or a coral frag or some rock rubble, or maybe even some chaetomorpha algae or something like that. They generally don't come in on fish, but once you have them, you've got them. Now, there are fish that can take care of these guys for you, 8-line wrasse and a 6-line wrasse, also a melanaris wrasse or a springeri damsel, but the fish are never 100%. They can get rid of most of them, but they probably won't ever get them all because there's going to be some deep in the rockwork and in places where the fish just can't get to. So there's a product on the market that you can use to eradicate these things from your tank once and for all, and it's called Flatworm Exit. But you need to be aware that these guys do have that toxin I mentioned within them, and as they begin to die off, which they do relatively fast when using Flatworm Exit, that product really works very well. But as they die off, they release those toxins into the aquarium, creating a toxic environment. Now, the way that you stop that from being a problem is by running activated carbon, and you want to run a little bit more than you normally would for your size of tank to be sure that you're sucking these toxins out. Additionally, you want to be ready to go. When you dose the tank with the Flatworm Exit, after a few minutes, it's going to start working. They'll start falling off the glass and the rocks. You want to start siphoning these things out before those toxins can be released. And once it's been running for a day or two, you've been siphoning these things out, you're running the carbon, then you want to be ready to do a big water change, at least 50%. There's no way to measure the amount of the toxins that are in the water, but be rest assured, if you're killing these flatworms, there is going to be toxin in your water, and you just need to take those preventative measures to make sure that it doesn't get too bad, because it can kill a whole tank if you just use this product and you don't take care of the toxins. We're going to step away from the animals for the next one, and we're going to talk about a single-celled organism that is bubble algae. If you see these little black or green shiny-looking bubbles in your tank, that's what it is. Now, this stuff really doesn't pose a massive problem for most of our corals, and certainly not any of our fish or invertebrates, but they can be unsightly and they can take over a tank really fast if the proper situation presents itself. The easiest way to fix these guys is to take the affected rock or coral out of the tank and use a sharp instrument to dig around underneath the bubble algae, popping it off outside the tank and getting rid of it. You can pop them off inside the tank, and sometimes you get lucky and they stay whole and they'll float up to the surface, and you can just dip them out with a net. Now, they can go sexual in your aquarium and begin to release spores, but this is quite rare, and that whole thing about don't pop the bubble algae because it'll spread isn't necessarily as big of a problem as most people make it out to be, but it is something that can happen, so you need to be aware of that. Now, there is an animal that can help you with this, and it's an emerald crab. Try, if you can, to get female emerald crabs. I don't have any scientific sites to base on this, but from what I've been told and what I've experienced myself in reef keeping, the female emerald crabs do a little bit better than the males do at taking care of this problem. So if you can get those, go with that. Now, once the bubble algae gets really big, the crabs seem to kind of ignore it, kind of like the peppermint shrimp with the aiptasia. But as the bubble algae are small, they will pick them off and eat them, and that's a good ecological option to just have in your tank anywhere. They're a great member of the cleanup crew, and having a few in your tank might go a long way to even preventing these problems from ever showing up in the first place. Cyanobacteria is the one that I want to talk about next, and this one is that red mat of slimy, snotty-looking stuff that you sometimes get on your sand bed and on your rocks and covering your corals and all of this stuff. This usually shows up due to a situation where there's a combination of events happening where there's not enough water flow, too much light, and an imbalance in water parameters. You want to try to maintain a nitrate to phosphate ratio of 100:1. When those ratios get flipped and the phosphates are now way higher than the nitrates where they should be to maintain that ratio, and you have low flow and you have excess light, sometimes cyano can show up. This is why it shows up in the presence of high nutrient tanks and in low nutrient tanks. It's not necessarily because the nutrients are high, it's usually because they're out of balance. So correcting that, getting that balance back where it should be, you can reduce the lighting a little bit in intensity and in photoperiod, and make sure you're exporting plenty of dissolved organics from the tanks, and manually vacuuming this stuff out is usually enough to get it fixed. In some cases, it's just relentlessly difficult to get this stuff gone, and you can use a product called ChemiClean, which is an antifungal medication, and it works great to kill cyanobacteria. But sometimes it can work too well, and you end up with dinoflagellates after the cyano, and we're going to talk about those in just a minute. If you're going to be running the ChemiClean on your tank, be sure that you follow the instructions explicitly, because you have to have adequate oxygenation in your tank. This stuff can create a situation where the oxygen is deprived of the tank. You can starve your fish of oxygen and they begin suffocating. So make sure you're running a skimmer. You'll have to take the lid off or the cup off, because the ChemiClean is going to make the skimmer go absolutely nuts. I would not recommend using a hang on the back skimmer when you're running ChemiClean, because that skimmer is absolutely going to overflow on you and make a mess on your floor. And it's going to do it in short order. And it's going to continue doing it the entire time you're running the ChemiClean in the tank, until you have done water changes after the 48-hour period to make sure that it's all cleaned up and out of the water. An alternative to that is an air stone somewhere in the tank, and that's going to be good enough to keep your oxygenation where it needs to be. Do not try to run ChemiClean in a tank without adding an oxygenation source. It's not going to go well for you, but it does work great to get rid of cyanobacteria. And now we're going to talk about dinoflagellates. I have a hate-hate relationship with these things, but they are something that are always present in our aquariums. It's just that they're not in enough concentration to be a problem. And they're outcompeted by diatoms, which is what we see when the tank turns brown about the 3 to 4 to 6 week mark of that tank being alive. That's why I am a huge proponent of letting the ugly phase of the tank progress as naturally as it needs to. It can get quite bad sometimes and make the tank look really bad. And people, when they see the tank like that, it doesn't look good. They want to take action against these diatoms. But having a good diatom population in your aquarium can stop you from getting a dinoflagellate explosion. And believe me, you would much rather be dealing with diatoms than dinoflagellates. There are typically 4 different species of dinoflagellates that we see in saltwater aquaria. There are many more than that, but the ones that we usually deal with are large cell amphidinium, small cell amphidinium, ostreopsis, and prorocentrum. Now, some of these are toxic, and when they get in your aquarium, they get on the algae. Your cleanup crew consumes the algae and thereby consumes the dinoflagellates, becomes toxic, and your cleanup crew dies. These things are an absolute nuisance to us, and the real main problem with them is each different species has a different track of things that you need to do to get rid of them. Some of them respond well to UV light on the aquarium because they free swim when the lights go off in the aquarium at night, but not all of them do that. Some of them stay buried in the sand, so you have to add silicates to the aquarium to induce that diatom explosion and redo another ugly phase so that it outcompetes the dinos. And really the only way that you're going to know for sure what kind of dinoflagellates you have and how to take care of them is with a microscope. Now you can get one like the one that I have here on the place where we get these things, and there's links in the description. This is going to be enough of a microscope for you to probably figure out what kind of diatoms you have, but it's also relatively inexpensive, and it's just a great tool to have for a reef aquarium. I recently had 2 types of dinoflagellates in this tank behind me. I had prorocentrum and ostreopsis, both of which were toxic, and that's what happened to my tank and resulted in the crash, which is why you see that I don't have any corals in the tank right now, except for these ones right down here in the corner and my rock flower anemones right over there. It was a sequence of events that resulted in an extremely toxic environment in my tank, and it started with palytoxin poisoning in the tank. But that's a video for a whole nother day. Moving right along to an organism that we didn't even know existed in the hobby until a couple of years ago. Reef keeping is always changing. It's always evolving. There's always new products and even new animals, and especially new pests coming into the hobby that we never knew existed. Euphyllia eating flatworms are an absolute menace to anybody who wants to keep Euphyllia corals, torches, frog spawns, hammers, frammers, that kind of thing. They feed exclusively on these corals, and they are voracious eaters. If you have Euphyllia eating flatworms in your tank, you are not going to have Euphyllia in your tank for very long. Now, fortunately, they're very easy to spot. If you take the coral out and you give it a good inspection, you can usually see these things because they can be quite big. So what do we do about it, and how do we prevent it? Dipping your corals before they go into your main display, and better yet, even quarantining all brand new coral before they go into the main tank, is going to be able to stop these things from getting into your display and causing you massive issues. There's all kinds of coral dips out there on the market. Most recently, I was using Fauna Marin Silly Dip or Chili Dip. I'm not really sure how you say it, but anyway, it worked great. You can do a hydrogen peroxide dip. You could do a KFC dip, and you can look that up to find out what that is. It's an antibiotic dip. What works for me is just simply a hydrogen peroxide dip, and you can find those directions on how to do that linked in the description below. But you do that for a couple of minutes. These flatworms fall off the corals. They're basically dead at that point. Then the coral can go into a temporary frag system or a quarantine tank where you can observe it for a day or two, 3 or 4 before you put it into the main display. That's all it takes. Dip your corals. I don't care where you got them from, how much you trust the people you got them from, or how much you trust the fish store or whatever. It doesn't matter if they say they dip their corals when they get them. Don't listen to any of that. Dip your corals before they go into your tank. But do your research and make sure you know what kind of dip and which corals can be dipped in what ways before you get ready to put them in your tank. Anyway, enough on the Euphyllia eating flatworms. Moving right along. And now let's talk about these ugly mugs. These are called Vermetid snails. They are a sessile snail, which means that they don't move around the aquarium. They find a spot to sit, and they build this little spirally shaped tube and then broadcast their mucus net out over your rocks and over your corals, pissing off your corals, stealing food from them, and generally just being an aggravating thing that makes your corals close up on you. Now, when you see these, there's a couple of ways that you can take care of them. Most recently, I have seen several people say that a blue stripe shark-nosed goby eats these things. Now, I've never witnessed that in person, but I've had at least half a dozen people tell me that in the last couple of months that they saw their goby eating these snails. So that's something that I want to move forward with in the hobby, trying to figure out if they really do. And if they do, we can begin to recommend that as a natural predator for these snails, and that would be awesome. Otherwise, you could simply remove the rock or coral that they're on, scrape them off, give it a rinse to get rid of them, and then put it back in the tank. Or you could use super glued gel and glue their little tubes shut, and then they can't feed themselves because their tube's glued shut, and they die and decay in their little tube, and everything's fine. Another thing that people have told me that they've done, and I tried this myself, and I saw limited success with it, but I did see some success, is using coral snow in the aquarium. Calcium carbonate in suspension in RODI water. You put it in the tank. The calcium carbonate gets stuck to their little mucus nets. They draw that into their tube. It binds all together in the tube, and it does exactly the same thing as the super glue. So those are some options for getting rid of this aggravating pest. The next two that we're going to talk about are the things of absolute nightmares. And the first one are Zoanthid eating spiders. Now, these dudes will absolutely destroy the zoanthids that are in your tanks, but they're actually not spiders at all. They are a member of the arthropod family, and there's over 1,300 different species of these things, and we do see them in the hobby sometimes. And you know what prevents them from getting in your display? I'm going to give you 1 second to guess. Dipping your corals. That's all you have to do. The same thing I was mentioning earlier, a hydrogen peroxide dip for just a minute, 90 seconds, something like that, is going to kill this organism It's going to fall off the coral. You could even get in there and pick them off with tweezers if you need to or whatever. Taking that simple, short precaution before you put your corals into your tank is going to make sure that you never get these things inside your aquarium. Because believe me, you do not want a colony of zoanthid eating spiders in your main display. They're ridiculously hard to get rid of at that point, and I have seen people have to do full-on tank teardowns to get rid of these things. So just dip your coral before you put it in your tank. That's all you got to do. Now this one strikes fear in the hearts of reef keepers sometimes, and before I tell you what it is, I'll just tell you that recently I saw somebody who had one of these things in their tank, and they ended up having to destroy a Montipora cap coral that was about this big. It was huge. They had to break it apart with a hammer to get this thing out of their tank. Now, what they had going on is they would put fish into the tank, and those fish would just disappear. There was no sign of that fish having ever been in that tank. And in the end, what they found that they had was like a 4-foot-long bobbit worm. And we do see these in the hobby very often sometimes. And it's another thing that comes in because we didn't properly clean a thing that we put into the tank. Usually it comes in on live rock that we get from the stores, and the worm is about this big or kind of small, and then it grows over time. It buries itself in the rockwork and the substrate, and you don't usually ever see it. They're usually nocturnal, so when the lights are off, they're catching your fish, they're catching your shrimps, and stuff's just disappearing. I am talking to somebody right now trying to get myself one because I think they're pretty cool, and I might have a place to hold one of those guys. But for most people, this is an absolute nightmare animal for their tank, and unfortunately, these do require a tank teardown most of the time to get them. Fortunately, there are ways to catch them without taking your tank apart sometimes. You can make a DIY trap to trap them, and you take just something like a big soda bottle, you cut the funnel end off of the bottle, invert that and put it back in, put some zip ties around the edge, poke a few holes in the bottle, leave it on the sand bed at night with a piece of a shrimp or something inside that bottle, and if you're lucky, you can catch the bobbit worm that's in your tank and you can get rid of him. Most of the time, that doesn't really work all that well, and you end up having to tear the tank apart. So if you get live rock from a store, one of the things that you can do to help prevent getting bobbit worms into your tank is dip the live rock. This is another situation of clean the things, dip the things, whatever, do some preventative maintenance before you put this in your aquarium. Now, there is one more animal that you will not find on this list of aquarium pests, and that is because personally, I don't think that they are pests at all. And those are bristleworms. And you can watch this video on the screen right now after you've subscribed, and you can check out all the information that you need to know about bristleworms. We'll see you next time.